Winston Churchill hailed him as the greatest savior of the British Empire. The public revered him as the iron-willed, invincible Spartan General. But behind the medals of Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery lay a flawless facade, concealing a secret that could have utterly destroyed him. He was a severely repressed homosexual. For decades, the legend has endured that MI5 intelligence had to step in to sanitize his private life. The architecture of Montgomery's mind was not forged in the sand dunes of Egypt, but in the soot-stained streets of London in 1887. This was the year of Queen Victoria's Golden Jubilee, a time when the British Empire was at the absolute zenith of its global power. It was an era defined by extreme contradictions, immense wealth and grinding poverty, rapid industrial progress, and rigid, suffocating social moralities. The Victorian society demanded absolute conformity, outward piety, and the strict suppression of any unseemly personal truths. It was into this unforgiving cultural landscape that Bernard Law Montgomery was born. His family was deeply embedded in the religious establishment of the time. His father, Henry Montgomery, was an Anglican minister who would eventually be appointed the Bishop of Tasmania. Henry was, by most accounts, a gentle and well-meaning man, but his dedication to his faith and his career rendered him largely absent from his children's lives. His missionary work and ecclesiastical duties required him to travel extensively, often disappearing for months at a time. This physical and emotional absence left a vacuum of authority in the Montgomery household, a vacuum that was swiftly and brutally filled by Bernard's mother. Maud Montgomery was a woman of chilling emotional detachment. In an era where child-rearing was often strict, Maud's methods crossed the line from Victorian discipline into systemic, relentless abuse. She ruled her children with an iron fist, utilizing physical punishment and psychological terror to enforce a regime of absolute obedience. Affection was non-existent. There were no words of comfort, no embraces, and no safe harbor within the walls of their home. Maud administered extreme beatings for the most trivial of infractions. A misplaced item, a slight delay in answering a summons, or a perceived lack of enthusiasm for daily prayers would result in severe corporal punishment. The young Bernard was subjected to this daily cruelty without any intervention from his absent father. Children respond to prolonged abuse in various ways. Some shatter completely, withdrawing into silence and submission. Bernard chose a different path. To survive the daily onslaught of his mother's tyranny, he systematically killed off his own vulnerability. He developed a hardened, impenetrable exterior. If showing pain or fear only invited further punishment, he would simply stop showing them. He became stubborn, defiant, and exceedingly difficult to manage. This hardening process had a dark side effect. Stripped of any model of empathy or nurturing, Bernard learned that human relationships were fundamentally about power and dominance. To protect himself from being the victim, he adopted the tactics of the aggressor. In his early years, and particularly when he was sent away to boarding school, he developed a reputation as a bully. He targeted boys who were smaller or weaker, exerting the control over them that he was so violently denied at home. It was a classic transfer of trauma, a desperate attempt by a damaged child to establish dominance in an unpredictable world. The culmination of this aggressive, erratic behavior occurred when Montgomery entered the Royal Military College at Sandhurst. Sandhurst was intended to mold young men into officers and gentlemen of the British Empire, but its internal culture was often savage, dominated by brutal hazing rituals and unchecked bullying among the cadets. Montgomery, carrying years of repressed rage, threw himself into this toxic environment. During his time at Sandhurst, Montgomery participated in a severe hazing incident that nearly ended his military career before it had even begun. He and a group of fellow cadets targeted another student, pinning him down and setting his shirt on fire. The prank escalated immediately out of control. The young man suffered horrific burns and required extended hospitalization. The Sandhurst administration was furious, and Montgomery faced imminent expulsion in disgrace. It was at this critical juncture that his family intervened. While historical records indicate an instructor at Sandhurst recognized his raw military potential and advocated for leniency, his mother, Maud, formally pleaded with the administration. Her intervention, however, was likely driven less by maternal love than a fierce desire to protect the Montgomery family's social standing. She helped persuade the military authorities to reduce his punishment. Montgomery was severely reprimanded and demoted in his cadet rank, but he was allowed to remain at the academy. If Maud expected gratitude for saving his career, she received none. The incident at Sandhurst clarified something fundamental for Montgomery. He realized the destructive trajectory of his own rage and understood that to survive in the military, the only escape route from his family, he needed to impose the same brutal discipline upon himself that his mother had imposed upon him, but entirely on his own terms. He severed his emotional ties completely. As he graduated from Sandhurst and took his commission in the British Army, Montgomery began the process of cutting his mother out of his life. The resentment had calcified into a permanent, icy detachment. He would not allow her or anyone else to hold emotional leverage over him again. This total alienation from the woman who gave birth to him left a massive, unhealed void in his psyche. Decades later, when Maud died in 1949, Montgomery was a global icon, a field marshal loaded with honors. Yet, when informed of her passing, the 62-year-old man did not shed a tear. He flatly refused to attend her funeral, stating coldly to the press and his family that he was too busy with military affairs. This absolute rejection of his origins was the foundation upon which the Spartan General was built. By the time he was a young subaltern facing the outbreak of the First World War, Bernard Montgomery had already survived one war, the war for his own autonomy against the cruelty of his upbringing. He walked away from his childhood with a chilling capacity for ruthlessness, an obsessive need for control, and a deeply buried emotional life that he would guard with the same ferocity he later applied to the defense of the British Isles. He was broken, perfectly reassembled for the machinery of modern warfare, and entirely unprepared for the horrors that awaited him in the mud of Flanders. The outbreak of the First World War in August 1914 hurled a generation of young men into an industrial slaughterhouse for which absolutely no one was prepared. The British Expeditionary Force arrived in France, carrying the tactical mindset of the 19th century, a belief in the cavalry charge, the bayonet, and the moral superiority of the offensive. They were met by the 20th century realities of interlocking machine gun fire, heavy artillery, and barbed wire. For a young subaltern like Bernard Law Montgomery, it was an immediate and brutal education in the mechanics of mass death. In October 1914, during the chaotic, desperate fighting near Ypres, Montgomery's platoon was ordered to attack the village of Metteren. It was pouring rain. The ground was already churning into the thick, freezing mud that would soon define the Western Front. The British soldiers, cold and exhausted, were ordered to advance across open ground with fixed bayonets against entrenched German positions. It was a tactical absurdity, a blunt force maneuver dictated by commanders who were already losing their grip on the reality of the battlefield. Montgomery led his men forward. The air snapped with the supersonic crack of sniper fire and the rhythmic, tearing sound of Maxim machine guns. In the midst of the charge, Montgomery was hit. A German sniper's bullet struck him squarely in the chest, piercing his right lung. The hydrostatic shock of the high-velocity round collapsed his lung instantly, dropping him into the mud. As he lay bleeding in no man's land, gasping for air and utterly exposed, a second bullet slammed into his right knee, shattering the bone. The chaos of the battlefield surged over and around him. Stretcher bearers eventually dragged him back to a casualty clearing station, but the triage protocols of 1914 were brutal and pragmatic. Medical resources were overwhelmed. Doctors had to quickly separate those who could be saved from those who were beyond help. Looking at the gaping chest wound, the compromised breathing, and the massive blood loss, the field surgeons categorized Montgomery as mortally wounded. They did not waste precious surgical time on him. Instead, he was laid aside, and an orderly was detailed to dig a shallow grave in the damp earth out back, ready to receive his body once he inevitably expired. But Montgomery did not die. The stubborn, defiant streak that had been beaten into him by his mother, the sheer belligerent refusal to submit to a higher authority, even if that authority was death itself, kept his heart beating. He lay in the cold, breathing shallowly through the blood filling his chest cavity, and clung to life through sheer, irrational force of will. When morning came, the medics were astonished to find him still breathing. Recognizing his inexplicable resilience, they finally evacuated him to a hospital in England. The physical recovery was agonizing and slow, leaving him with a permanent stiffness and a lung that would never fully function again. But the psychological impact of Metternich was profound and irreversible. Montgomery had looked directly into the abyss. He had felt the cold reality of being treated as disposable meat by a military machine that did not care about his individual survival. When he returned to the Western Front, he did so as a staff officer. From this vantage point, slightly removed from the frontline trenches, he was forced to watch the grand strategies of the British High Command unfold over the next 4 years. He witnessed the Battle of the Somme in 1916, where 57,000 British casualties were sustained on the very first day, achieving nothing but the relocation of mud. He saw the nightmare of Passchendaele in 1917, where men and pack animals simply vanished. Drowning in craters of liquid earth, Montgomery developed a visceral, burning hatred for the senior leadership. He despised the chateau generals like Douglas Haig, commanders who lived in comfortable headquarters miles behind the lines, eating fine meals, drinking port, and moving pins on pristine maps. These men possessed a chilling detachment from the flesh and blood consequences of their orders. They treated human lives as raw currency, throwing tens of thousands of men at unbroken wire simply because they lacked the imagination or the professional competence to devise a better tactic. For Montgomery, incompetence in a commander was not just a professional failing, it was a profound moral crime. He watched his peers and the men under his indirect command be systematically wiped out by bad planning and inflexible dogma. He realized that the British Army was an amateur institution fighting a professional war. It was in the shadow of this immense, pointless slaughter that Montgomery made a solemn, private vow that would dictate the rest of his life. He decided that he would dedicate every waking hour, every ounce of his intellect, to mastering the profession of arms. War was not an adventure. It was a brutal, exacting science. He swore that if he were ever granted high command, he would understand the logistical, tactical, and psychological realities of the battlefield better than anyone else. Most importantly, he promised himself that he would never, under any circumstances, waste the lives of his soldiers through carelessness, poor preparation, or detachment. To fulfill this vow, Montgomery realized he had to rebuild himself entirely. He could not afford the distractions, the vices, or the sloppy thinking that characterized the traditional British officer class. He had to become a machine. He instituted a regime of extreme asceticism that would soon earn him the moniker of the Spartan General. He surveyed the culture of the officers' mess, the heavy drinking, the chain smoking, the late nights playing cards, the casual womanizing, and rejected all of it. He refused to consume a single drop of alcohol. He never smoked. He adopted a strict, almost monastic diet, favoring plain food and abhorring gluttony. He committed himself to a daily routine of intense physical exercise, running for miles to keep his damaged body as sharp and resilient as possible. But the most famous, and perhaps the most psychologically revealing, aspect of his new lifestyle was his absolute commitment to his sleep schedule. Montgomery mandated that he would go to bed at precisely 9:30 p.m. every single night. It did not matter if he was in a peacetime barracks or if the front lines were collapsing under an enemy artillery barrage. When the clock struck 9:30, Montgomery retired to his cot. On the surface, this was explained as a necessary measure to ensure his mind was always sharp, rested, and capable of clear decision-making at dawn. And functionally, it worked. But beneath the surface, this rigid adherence to routine was a psychological fortress. The 9:30 p.m. bedtime was an assertion of ultimate control in a world defined by unpredictable, violent chaos. If he could control his own body, his own habits, and his own environment with absolute, unbreakable precision, then the madness of the war could not touch him. Furthermore, this extreme discipline served an unstated, deeply private purpose. By isolating himself from the social rituals of the officers' mess, by removing himself from the late-night drinking sessions where men dropped their guard and shared their vulnerabilities, Montgomery protected his deepest secret. His ascetic lifestyle was the perfect camouflage for his repressed sexuality. He did not have to explain his lack of interest in women, his refusal to visit brothels, or his emotional distance, because it was all neatly subsumed under the universally respected banner of his military dedication. He was simply a man entirely consumed by his profession. He had built a flawless, impenetrable wall between himself and the world, a wall constructed of duty, routine, and a chilling emotional isolation. He was now perfectly prepared for the machinery of war, precisely because he had excised so much of his own humanity to get there. The armistice of 1918 brought a sudden, jarring silence to the battlefields of Europe. But for Bernard Montgomery, the cessation of artillery fire did not mean the end of hostilities. It merely shifted the theater of his internal war. As the British Army rapidly demobilized and shrank back into a neglected peacetime institution, Montgomery found himself navigating a civilian and social landscape for which he was entirely unequipped. The extreme asceticism that had kept him alive and sane in the trenches, his rigid schedules, his absolute refusal of alcohol, his physical fanaticism, now rendered him a social pariah in the Roaring Twenties. While his fellow officers celebrated their survival in the jazz clubs and drawing rooms of London, drinking heavily and desperately trying to forget the mud of Flanders, Montgomery remained isolated. He dedicated his peacetime hours to writing training manuals, aggressively drilling his men, and dissecting the tactical failures of the recent war. He was a master of infantry maneuvers, but he was entirely illiterate in the language of human intimacy. By his mid-30s, Montgomery was a man who could confidently order a battalion into the teeth of enemy fire, but who broke into a cold sweat at the prospect of a polite conversation with a woman. His childhood, devoid of any maternal warmth, had left him with no template for romantic affection. His youth had been consumed by the hyper-masculine, emotionally stunted environment of boarding schools, Sandhurst, and the wartime officer corps. He simply did not understand how women thought, what they valued, or how a man was supposed to approach them. To Montgomery, every problem was a military problem, requiring a direct, tactical solution. This mindset led to one of the most painfully awkward courtships in recorded history. In 1925, at the age of 37, Montgomery was stationed in England and decided, with cold strategic logic, that it was time for him to take a wife. A senior officer was expected to be married. It was a matter of professional propriety. During a holiday in Dinard, a resort town on the coast of Brittany, he fixed his sights on Betty Anderson, a vibrant, outgoing 17-year-old girl. The age gap alone was staggering, but it was Montgomery's approach that bordered on the absurd. He treated courtship as a tactical objective to be secured through overwhelming logic and strategic demonstration. He invited the teenage girl for a romantic walk along the beach. As they strolled beside the crashing waves, a setting that demanded light conversation and charm, Montgomery stopped, found a piece of driftwood, and began to draw furiously in the wet sand. He was not drawing hearts or writing poetry. He was sketching out complex diagrams of tank deployments, infantry flanking maneuvers, and enfilading artillery fire. He spent the duration of their date delivering a stern, unsolicited lecture on how modern combined arms operations should be executed on a European battlefield. He believed that by demonstrating his absolute professional competence, he would logically secure her affection. When he abruptly concluded his military briefing by proposing marriage, the terrified teenager fled. She rejected him immediately, bewildered by the intense, socially inept soldier who seemed to view a wife as merely another logistical asset. The rejection stung, driving Montgomery further into his shell. He concluded that the world of romance was chaotic, illogical, and better left alone. He retreated back behind the high walls of his military discipline. It seemed destined that he would live out his days as a bitter, solitary ascetic. But 2 years later, in 1927, the impenetrable armor cracked. While on a skiing holiday in Switzerland, Montgomery met someone entirely different from the frightened teenager on the beach. Her name was Betty Carver. She was not a naive girl, but a woman in her late 30s who understood the heavy toll of the 20th century. Betty was a war widow. Her first husband had been killed at the Battle of Gallipoli, leaving her to raise 2 young sons alone. She carried her own profound grief, and perhaps because of it, she possessed a deep, intuitive empathy. When she looked at the rigid, abrasive Major Montgomery, she did not see a frightening fanatic. She saw a profoundly damaged man who was desperately lonely. Betty Carver possessed the rare emotional intelligence required to navigate Montgomery's jagged edges. She was entirely unintimidated by his bark, his strict routines, or his lack of social grace. Instead of trying to break his rules, she gently worked around them. She introduced a quiet, patient warmth into his life that he had never experienced, not from his mother, and certainly not from the army. To the absolute astonishment of his colleagues, who viewed him as a terrifying, heartless automaton, Montgomery fell deeply and irrevocably in love. They were married later that year. The transformation in Montgomery was subtle but undeniable. For the first time in his 40 years of existence, he had a safe harbor. Betty managed his eccentricities with grace, acting as a social buffer between her husband's blunt tactlessness and the polite society of the British military establishment. She smoothed over his insults, hosted dinners that he would have otherwise avoided, and provided a domestic stability that grounded him. In 1928, she gave birth to their son, David. For a single decade, from 1927 to 1937, Bernard Montgomery experienced genuine human happiness. Photographs from this era show something incredibly rare: the Spartan General, smiling, sitting in a garden with a child on his lap, looking relaxed. Betty had achieved the impossible. She had reached into the dark, locked machinery of his mind and found the capacity for love that his mother had nearly beaten out of him. He became a devoted, if somewhat strict, father to his stepsons and his biological son. The relentless pressure of his internal demons seemed for a brief window in time to ease. He was still a fiercely demanding officer, still obsessive about military training, but he was no longer entirely alone in the universe. Then, the universe reasserted its cruelty with a terrifying, mundane randomness. In August 1937, the Montgomery family was enjoying a seaside holiday in Burnham-on-Sea in Somerset. It was a perfectly ordinary summer day. Betty was walking barefoot along the beach when she felt a sharp pinch on her leg. She had been bitten by an unidentified insect. In the modern era, such an event warrants little more than an antihistamine cream. But in 1937, the world was still years away from the mass production of penicillin. Antibiotics were virtually non-existent for the general public. Within days, the bite site became inflamed. The inflammation rapidly turned into a severe, aggressive infection. The bacteria entered her bloodstream, triggering a cascading medical crisis. Betty developed a raging fever and fell into a state of delirium. Montgomery, the man who prided himself on being able to control any situation, found himself utterly powerless. He brought in the best specialists he could find, barking orders at doctors as if they were junior officers, demanding they fix his wife. But medical science of the time had no strategic answer to septicemia. In a desperate last-ditch effort to halt the spread of the infection and save her life, the surgeons recommended a horrific course of action: amputation. Montgomery agreed, authorizing the doctors to amputate Betty's leg. It was a brutal procedure, undertaken with the desperate hope of cutting away the poison before it reached her vital organs. It was not enough. The infection had already colonized her blood. The amputation only added to the severe trauma her body was enduring. For days, Montgomery sat silently by her hospital bed, gripping her hand. He watched the only source of warmth he had ever known slowly slip away. On October 19, 1937, Betty Carver died in his arms. Her death did not just break Montgomery's heart. It destroyed the entire emotional infrastructure he had painstakingly built over the last 10 years. The grief was absolute and paralyzing. At her funeral, the man who would later send hundreds of thousands of men into the meat grinder of the Second World War without a visible tremor wept uncontrollably. He was practically carried away from her graveside. The psychological response to this trauma was immediate and catastrophic. Having finally risked vulnerability, having finally opened the heavy steel doors of his emotional life, the resulting pain of loss was too much for his psyche to bear. The defense mechanisms forged during his abusive childhood slammed violently back into place. If love resulted in this level of agonizing devastation, he would simply never love again. Montgomery locked away Betty's belongings and rarely spoke her name again. He threw away the key to his private life. He made a silent, unbreakable vow never to remarry, and he developed a sudden, visceral intolerance for the presence of women in his professional sphere. Following Betty's death, Montgomery permanently sealed his emotional life. The British Army was no longer just his profession. It became his sole remaining reality, a sterile environment where unpredictable human grief was replaced by absolute operational control. As Adolf Hitler's armies began to march across the continent, Montgomery welcomed the coming conflict. He needed the distraction of mass logistics and the intense pressure of operational command to drown out the silence of his empty home. He faced the German Wehrmacht not as a complete human being, but as a weapon completely stripped of its emotional tethers. The death of Betty Carver did not just widow Bernard Montgomery. It sealed him entirely inside a psychological vault of his own design. When Britain declared war on Nazi Germany in September 1939, Montgomery was already a man operating on a footing of total war within his own mind. He embraced the immense, crushing logistical and tactical demands of the conflict because they demanded his absolute focus. There was no room left for grief, no space for the agonizing silence of an empty house, and crucially, no vulnerability. The military became his only reality, his sanctuary and his shield. But as modern military historians and biographers began to meticulously comb through his private papers decades after his death, a far more complex picture of this sanctuary emerged. The British public believed Montgomery retreated into the army out of sheer patriotic duty and grief for his wife. The truth, as revealed in hundreds of private, handwritten letters, was that the British Army provided the perfect camouflage for a man carrying a secret that would have utterly destroyed him. According to exhaustive research by his official biographer Nigel Hamilton and supported by modern historians of British sexuality, Montgomery was highly likely a profoundly repressed homosexual. While some military scholars argue he was simply emotionally stunted by childhood trauma, the consensus points to a severe psychological compartmentalization that shaped his command style, his relationships with his officers, and the fiercely guarded environment of his headquarters. To understand the gravity of this repression, one must discard modern sensibilities and look at the brutal legal and cultural realities of mid-20th century Britain. Homosexuality was not merely a social taboo. It was a severe criminal offense. The Criminal Law Amendment Act of 1885, the exact same legislation that had ruined and imprisoned the playwright Oscar Wilde, remained firmly in place. The British establishment viewed homosexuality as a moral rot, a security risk, and a disease that demanded eradication. If a senior military officer were discovered to have homosexual tendencies, the consequences were immediate and total. He would be stripped of his rank, court-martialed, publicly disgraced, and imprisoned. His legacy would be erased. For Montgomery, a man who had already survived a childhood of abuse and the senseless slaughter of the First World War by clinging to his military identity, discovery meant annihilation. There was no choice but to suppress these desires with the same iron-fisted discipline he applied to his infantry divisions. Repression, however, is rarely a clean or complete process. Human beings, no matter how disciplined, require emotional connection and intimacy. For Montgomery, these suppressed desires manifested themselves not in illicit physical affairs, which he avoided with absolute paranoia, but in intense, emotionally charged relationships with young men under his command. He engineered a working environment that surrounded him exclusively with male youth, creating a hyper-masculine surrogate family where he could exercise a dominating, yet deeply affectionate paternal role. This dynamic was most visible in his creation of a highly unorthodox system of liaison officers. When Montgomery took command of the 8th Army in North Africa, and later the 21st Army Group in Europe, he bypassed the traditional chain of communication. Instead of relying on senior staff officers or written reports filtering up through the ranks, he handpicked a cadre of young, intelligent, and exceptionally handsome junior officers to serve as his personal eyes and ears on the battlefield. They were universally known as Monty's boys. These young men, often in their early 20s, were granted unprecedented access to the field marshal. They drove out to the front lines every morning, observed the fighting, and reported directly back to Montgomery's private tactical headquarters every evening. But the relationship extended far beyond military utility. Montgomery doted on them. He worried about their safety, managed their careers, and, most tellingly, wrote them intensely affectionate, private letters. He sought their constant companionship, insisting they eat meals with him and share his quiet hours. It was an environment of intense, focused male intimacy. In these relationships, Montgomery engaged in what historians categorize as quasi-love affairs. He poured out his emotional reserves to these young men, expressing a tenderness and dependency that he hid entirely from his peers and the public. He offered them the mentorship and protection he had never received from his own parents. Crucially, however, the overwhelming historical consensus is that these relationships never crossed the line into physical consummation. The risk was too astronomical, and his own moral conditioning was too severe. He lived in a state of permanent tension, seeking the emotional closeness of the men he found attractive, while using his ferocious military discipline to ensure the boundary of physical touch was never breached. This behavior was not entirely unprecedented in the annals of the British military. Montgomery was walking a path previously forged by another titan of the empire, Field Marshal Lord Kitchener. Kitchener, the hero of the Boer War and the face of the famous "Your Country Needs You" recruitment posters of the First World War, had also lived a solitary, ascetic life devoid of women. He, too, surrounded himself with a tight circle of young, attractive aides-de-camp, creating a private male sanctuary within the rigid hierarchy of the armed forces. Both men found that the harsh, segregated environment of wartime command provided a socially acceptable mechanism to avoid heterosexual expectations while building intense, emotionally fulfilling bonds with younger men. In the Army, a man could express deep devotion to his subordinates under the guise of leadership and camaraderie without drawing the suspicion of civilian society. Yet, the immense psychological effort required to maintain this repression created deep fissures in Montgomery's personality, most notably in his aggressive, often irrational hostility toward women. Following Betty's death, Montgomery slammed the door on female companionship, but he went further, actively attempting to purge the feminine presence from his military universe. He viewed the concept of marriage among his officers not just as a distraction, but as an active threat to the cohesiveness of the military unit. Montgomery frequently lectured his subordinates on the evils of domestic attachment. He loudly proclaimed that an officer could not possibly dedicate himself to the destruction of the enemy if a fraction of his mind was worried about a wife back home. When he took command of British forces preparing for the invasion of Europe, he issued draconian orders prohibiting his staff officers from bringing their wives anywhere near his headquarters, and he actively punished those who sought to prioritize their marriages over their duties. He constructed a tactical environment that was utterly sterile, devoid of wives, girlfriends, or female staff. On one level, this draconian order was a brutal projection of his own grief. The universe had taken his wife, so he demanded his men willingly forfeit theirs. But fundamentally, women were a glaring reminder of the heterosexual norms he could not fulfill and the civilian world he had abandoned. By issuing strict orders to ban wives from his headquarters, Montgomery militarized his own isolation, violently protecting the boundaries of his carefully constructed sanctuary. This rigid moral stance against domestic attachments, however, collided violently with the practical realities of commanding hundreds of thousands of enlisted men. It was here that Montgomery demonstrated a chilling, pure pragmatism that deeply offended the religious and moral establishment of the British Army. While he demanded monastic dedication from his officers, he recognized that the average infantryman, facing death daily, would inevitably seek out sexual release. In North Africa and Italy, the rates of venereal disease among British troops were skyrocketing, threatening to decimate the fighting strength of his divisions faster than the German artillery. The traditional military approach was to preach abstinence, distribute moral pamphlets, and rely on the chaplains to keep the men in line. Montgomery looked at the statistics and immediately discarded Victorian morality in favor of raw military efficiency. If the men were going to have sex, he decided, the army would control and regulate the supply to protect the health of the troops. He mandated practical preventative measures, including the strict distribution of prophylactics and the medical regulation of existing red light districts where troops rested. He approached these measures with the same cold, analytical precision he applied to the distribution of ammunition or rations. When the senior chaplains of the 8th Army discovered this, they were outraged. They petitioned the War Office, demanding the brothels be shut down, horrified that the so-called Spartan General, the son of a bishop, was officially sanctioning vice. Montgomery's response was swift and uncompromising. He ignored the chaplains entirely. To him, the morality of the act was entirely irrelevant. The only metric that mattered was whether his infantry battalions were physically fit to fight Rommel the next morning. It was a staggering display of cognitive dissonance. The man who ruthlessly purged the emotional presence of women from his own life and from the lives of his officers was simultaneously acting as the chief logistical architect for the sexual gratification of his soldiers. It proved that for Montgomery, human beings, their desires, their griefs, and their moralities were ultimately just variables in a tactical equation. He had learned to turn off his own humanity to survive, and he expected the machinery of his army to operate with the exact same ruthless mechanical efficiency. The absolute victory of the Allied forces in 1945 brought Field Marshal Montgomery a level of global adulation unmatched by any living British soldier. He was elevated to the peerage as Viscount Montgomery of Alamein. He rode through the streets of London, Paris, and New York to the roar of millions. Winston Churchill hailed him as the man who had turned the tide of the entire war. He was appointed Chief of the Imperial General Staff, the absolute pinnacle of the British military hierarchy. But when the ticker tape parades finally ended, when the cheering crowds dispersed and the vast machinery of the wartime army was systematically dismantled, Montgomery was forced to return to a reality he had spent 6 years trying to outrun. He went home to an empty house. The war had been his ultimate distraction. The crushing responsibility of commanding millions of men, the daily life or death strategic decisions, and the constant, high-stakes adrenaline of the battlefield had perfectly insulated him from his own grief. With the collapse of Nazi Germany, his sanctuary vanished. Montgomery was suddenly a man in his late 50s, a widower, fundamentally estranged from his own mother, possessing no close civilian friends, and entirely unable to relate to women. His biological son, David, was away at boarding school, and their relationship, while loving in its own rigid way, was heavily strained by Montgomery's domineering, unsympathetic nature. The field marshal was, despite his immense fame, one of the loneliest men in the British Empire. It was in this desperate post-war silence that Montgomery began to exhibit behaviors that would later spark some of the most vicious and sensational rumors of his legacy. Stripped of his wartime family, of young, handsome liaison officers, who had all returned to their civilian lives and marriages, Montgomery began to seek out the companionship of adolescent boys. The most prominent and heavily scrutinized of these relationships began in the winter of 1946. Seeking relief from the bureaucratic drudgery of the War Office in London, Montgomery traveled to Switzerland for a skiing holiday. There, amidst the snow-capped peaks of the Alps, the supreme commander of the British Armed Forces struck up an intense, highly unusual friendship with a 12-year-old local Swiss boy named Lucien Trube. To modern sensibilities, heavily conditioned by decades of horrific scandals involving powerful men and minors, the optics of this relationship are immediately alarming. Montgomery, a man of immense global power, wealth, and influence, actively courted the attention of a child. He invited Lucien to join him on his daily walks. He bought the boy gifts. When the holiday ended, Montgomery did not simply say goodbye. He initiated a relentless correspondence. He wrote hundreds of private handwritten letters to Lucien, pouring out his thoughts, his daily frustrations, and his deep affection. He subsequently paid for the boy's education, frequently invited him on international holidays, and insisted on maintaining a close, mentoring presence in the child's life for years. Lucien Trube was not an isolated case. As the years progressed, Montgomery gravitated heavily toward organizations like the Boy Scouts. He would spend hours visiting scout camps, sitting around campfires, and inspecting the troops of young boys with the same grave seriousness he had once reserved for his armored divisions before D-Day. Furthermore, Nigel Hamilton, the historian who would later become Montgomery's official biographer, revealed that he himself had been the recipient of this overwhelming attention. When Hamilton was just a young teenager, Montgomery took a profound interest in him, writing him over 100 highly emotional, affectionate letters, constantly seeking his company and offering unsolicited, intense mentorship. Inevitably, as Montgomery aged and these patterns of behavior became an open secret among the British establishment, dark rumors began to circulate. Whispers in the halls of Whitehall and the gentlemen's clubs of London suggested that the hero of El Alamein was a predator. Following his death, sensationalist media and speculative writers attempted to retroactively brand him with the label of pedophilia, suggesting that his repressed homosexuality had mutated into something sinister and abusive in his later years. However, rigorous historical investigation by credible scholars has aggressively and definitively dismantled this accusation. The historical record, built on exhaustive interviews with the men who were once these boys, including Lucien Trube and Nigel Hamilton themselves, confirms one absolute truth. These relationships were entirely asexual. Esteemed historians of British sexuality, such as Ronald Hyam, alongside military peers like Field Marshal Michael Carver, have thoroughly investigated these claims. Their conclusions are unanimous. There was never a single instance of inappropriate physical contact, sexual advancement, or predatory grooming in any of Montgomery's interactions with these boys. The letters, while emotionally intense and suffocatingly affectionate, contained no physical innuendo. The relationships were perfectly chaste. To label Montgomery a pedophile is not merely a distortion of history. It is a fundamental misunderstanding of the catastrophic psychological damage he was carrying. If not sexual, then what drove a man who had stared down the German war machine to seek the constant companionship of 12-year-olds? The answer lies in the deep, unhealed wounds of his Victorian childhood and the traumatic severance of his only romantic relationship. Psychologists refer to this behavior as the manifestation of residual requirements. Bernard Montgomery was a man whose emotional development had been violently arrested by the abuse of his mother, Maud. He was entirely robbed of the innocence, warmth, and unconditional love that are meant to define childhood. When he finally found a surrogate for that love in his wife, Betty, she was cruelly ripped away from him by a random infection, reinforcing his subconscious belief that adult love was dangerous and impermanent. By surrounding himself with adolescent boys, Montgomery was subconsciously attempting to rebuild the childhood he had been denied, and simultaneously to act as the loving, protective father figure he had never had. Young boys offered something that adult men and women could not: absolute, uncritical adoration. They were not intimidated by his rank. They did not judge his social awkwardness, and they did not carry the complex, threatening sexual dynamics of adult women. When Montgomery sat in a tent with a group of Boy Scouts, or walked through the Swiss Alps with young Lucien, he was experiencing a pure, uncomplicated emotional warmth that had completely eluded him for his entire life. He was trying to heal his own broken inner child by proxy. He projected his vast, unused reserves of paternal affection onto these boys, trying desperately to guide them, protect them, and ensure their success in a way that no one had ever done for him. The tragedy of Bernard Montgomery in his post-war years was that he was a man capable of loving deeply but utterly terrified of the consequences of expressing it to an adult equal. He was trapped in an emotional paradox. He possessed the strategic genius to liberate a continent, but lacked the psychological tools to navigate a simple, reciprocal adult relationship. Therefore, he poured his humanity into the safest, most innocent vessels he could find. The letters he wrote to Lucien Trube and Nigel Hamilton were not the tools of a predator. They were the desperate, lonely cries of an orphaned soul hiding behind the uniform of a field marshal, begging for a connection that would not end in abandonment or betrayal. Yet, the public and the political establishment could not see the frightened child hiding behind the medals. They saw only the eccentric, increasingly difficult, and fiercely opinionated public figure. Because his private life was so bizarrely devoid of normal romantic attachments, and because he spent his holidays with teenagers rather than women of his own age, the rumors of his homosexuality and inappropriate behavior constantly threatened to breach the surface of public awareness. This persistent underlying tension has given rise to one of the most enduring myths surrounding Montgomery's legacy: the belief that the British intelligence services were forced to construct a massive, invisible wall of lies to protect his reputation from being destroyed by his own nature. The enduring myth that the British government, specifically the Domestic Counterintelligence Service known as MI5, engaged in a massive, coordinated campaign to cover up Field Marshal Montgomery's repressed homosexuality, is one of the most persistent urban legends of the Second World War. It is a compelling narrative, especially to a modern audience accustomed to political scandals and institutional cover-ups. The logic seems sound. Here was the ultimate hero of the British Empire, the man who defeated Rommel and commanded the ground forces at Normandy, living a life that secretly violated the draconian morality laws of the 1940s. Surely, the theory goes, the highest levels of government must have known. Surely, they must have deployed agents to silence rumors, intercept mail, and threaten journalists to preserve the flawless image of the Spartan General. When the archives were eventually declassified, historians rushed to examine the files, expecting to find the paper trail of this grand conspiracy. What they found instead was a profound silence regarding his sexuality. There was no MI5 cover-up of Bernard Montgomery's private life for a very simple, tragic reason. There was nothing to cover up. Montgomery's own psychological defense mechanisms were far more effective than any intelligence agency could ever be. MI5 did not need to hide his private life because Montgomery had already eradicated it. He was his own most ruthless censor. His famous asceticism, the refusal to attend parties, the absolute ban on alcohol, the bizarrely rigid bedtime of 9:30 p.m. acted as an impenetrable shield. To the press and the public, these were the quirks of a military genius entirely consumed by the burden of command. No one probed deeper because Montgomery never gave them a thread to pull. He never placed himself in compromising situations. He never visited the underground establishments of wartime London. He sublimated his desires so completely into his military persona and his intense mentorship of young officers that the civilian world simply accepted him as a man without a sexual dimension. He was married to the army. The government did not have to protect his reputation from scandal because Montgomery's terrifying self-discipline ensured that a scandal was physically impossible. However, the absence of a sexual cover-up does not mean that MI5 was absent from Montgomery's life. On the contrary, the intelligence services were deeply, obsessively involved with him, but their focus was entirely on protecting the military asset, not the man's emotional secrets. Montgomery was arguably the most recognizable face of the British war effort besides Winston Churchill. This made him an invaluable tool for strategic deception and simultaneously a prime target for assassination. The actual operations MI5 ran involving Montgomery are far more fascinating than the fictionalized cover-ups, revealing just how thoroughly the British establishment viewed him as a piece of strategic hardware. As the spring of 1944 approached, the Allied High Command was consumed by a single monumental objective: Operation Overlord, the invasion of Normandy. The success of D-Day hinged entirely on the element of surprise. The German High Command, led by Montgomery's old adversary Erwin Rommel, knew an invasion was coming, but they did not know where or when. To ensure the Germans kept their armored divisions dispersed, the Allies launched a massive deception campaign known as Operation Bodyguard. They needed to convince Hitler that the real attack was going to hit the Pas-de-Calais, or perhaps even southern France or the Balkans, and that Normandy was merely a diversion. To sell this lie, MI5 realized they needed to use their most potent psychological weapon, Montgomery himself. The Germans knew that wherever Montgomery was, the main assault was sure to follow, but the real Montgomery was in England, frantically finalizing the invasion plans and relentlessly drilling his troops. MI5 needed Montgomery to be in two places at once. This requirement gave birth to Operation Copperhead. The intelligence service set out to find a body double. The search led them to Merrick Clifton James, an obscure, mildly successful peacetime actor who was currently serving in a mundane administrative role in the Royal Army Pay Corps. James was a mild-mannered man who had lost a finger in the First World War, enjoyed a drink, and smoked heavily, the absolute antithesis of the field marshal in personality. But physically, the resemblance was uncanny. When he wore the iconic black beret and the precisely tailored battle dress, the illusion was staggering. MI5 plucked James from obscurity and subjected him to a bizarre and intense psychological assignment. He was told he was going to impersonate a man whose face was known to millions, under the watchful eyes of enemy spies, where a single slip in character could result in the deaths of thousands of Allied soldiers on the beaches of France. James was attached to Montgomery's staff under the guise of an observer. For weeks, he shadowed the field marshal, studying him with the desperate intensity of an actor preparing for the role of his life. And it was here, through the eyes of an ordinary civilian actor, that the sheer exhausting reality of being Bernard Montgomery became apparent. James struggled to mimic the sharp, authoritative bark of Montgomery's voice. He had to learn the field marshal's peculiar, rigid salute, Most difficult of all, James had to entirely suppress his own habits. He was forbidden to smoke or drink. He had to adopt the punishing physical pace of a man who treated every waking moment as a military exercise. James later recalled that merely pretending to be Montgomery for a few weeks nearly drove him to a nervous breakdown. The relentless, joyless discipline required to maintain the Spartan General persona was physically and emotionally agonizing. Days before the Normandy landings, the trap was sprung. The real Montgomery remained hidden away in his command caravan in England. Meanwhile, M. Clifton James, dressed as the field marshal, was flown on a private aircraft to Gibraltar, a known hotbed of German espionage. The British intentionally arranged for James to be seen by a Spanish official known to be a Nazi informant. James strode out of the aircraft, delivered Montgomery's signature salute, and held meetings with the local commanders. He then flew to Algiers in North Africa, making highly visible public appearances. The deception worked perfectly. German intelligence intercepted the reports from their spies in the Mediterranean. They concluded that if the supreme commander of the Allied ground forces was touring North Africa, an invasion across the English Channel could not possibly be imminent, and a secondary attack in the south was highly likely. Rommel himself relaxed, eventually returning to Germany to celebrate his wife's birthday, leaving the Atlantic Wall without its primary architect. On the very morning the Allied Armada appeared on the horizon, Operation Copperhead demonstrated exactly how the British state utilized Montgomery. They did not care about the man's internal struggles or his profound loneliness. They cared about the silhouette he cast on a runway in Gibraltar. He was a symbol to be deployed, a psychological weapon aimed directly at the minds of the German High Command. But being the symbol of the British war effort carried extreme physical risks. While MI5 was using Montgomery's image to deceive the enemy abroad, they were simultaneously fighting a desperate shadow war at home to keep the real Montgomery alive. History often glosses over the fact that Britain contained a small but fiercely dedicated network of fascist sympathizers who actively sought to sabotage the war effort from within. These were not merely individuals expressing dissenting opinions. They were organized fifth columnists willing to commit high treason and murder for the Nazi cause. As the preparations for D-Day accelerated, a faction within this British fascist underground began planning the decapitation of the Allied leadership. Their primary targets were the Supreme Allied Commander, Dwight D. Eisenhower, and Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery. The threat was severe enough that MI5 authorized one of the most audacious counterintelligence operations of the war. An unassuming bank clerk named Eric Roberts, who possessed an extraordinary talent for deep cover infiltration, was recruited by MI5. Roberts was given the codename Jack King. His mission was to penetrate the fascist networks in London, not by pretending to be a British agent, but by posing as an operative of the Gestapo working undercover in the heart of England. Roberts was terrifyingly effective. He embedded himself so deeply into the fascist underground that he became the central node for their treacherous activities. He identified a woman named Marita Perigo, a British citizen of fiercely pro-Nazi convictions who had managed to construct a network of informants and saboteurs. Perigo and her associates, including a highly motivated woman named Eileen Gleave, began formulating specific, actionable plans to assassinate Montgomery. They tracked his movements, studied his routines, and sought to acquire the weapons necessary to eliminate the most vital commander in the British Army. Because Jack King had successfully convinced these fascists that he was their Gestapo handler, they brought their assassination plots directly to him for approval and logistical support. Roberts calmly collected their plans, praised their dedication to the Third Reich, and funneled every piece of intelligence straight back to MI5 headquarters. By controlling the conspiracy from the inside, MI5 was able to neutralize the threat without ever having to make public arrests that would alert the Germans to the fact that their fifth column in Britain had been entirely compromised. They simply allowed the assassination plots to die in the planning stages, meticulously misdirecting the conspirators while ensuring Montgomery was never in any actual danger. These operations, Copperhead and the infiltration by Jack King, represent the true, documented history of MI5's relationship with Field Marshal Montgomery. The intelligence services surrounded him, monitored him, duplicated him, and protected him, but they did so to safeguard the machinery of the war effort, not to protect the fragile, traumatized human being hiding inside the uniform. The stark contrast between the myth and the reality is deeply poignant. The public wanted to believe that the government cared enough about Monty to protect his private life. The reality was that the government only cared about his utility. Montgomery was left entirely alone to manage the crushing weight of his repressed identity, his grief, and his childhood trauma. He fought the Germans with the full backing of the British Empire, but he fought the war inside his own mind with absolutely no allies, no cover-ups, and no one to rely on but his own punishing, ultimately destructive discipline. As the dust settled on the ruins of Europe in the late 1940s, the world transitioned from the terrifying clarity of total war into the murky, anxious shadows of the Cold War. For a man like Bernard Montgomery, this shift was profoundly destabilizing. He was a creature engineered for absolute conflict. On a battlefield, the rules were brutal but simple. You identified the enemy, you gathered your resources, and you destroyed them. But the post-war world required diplomacy, political compromise, and tact, qualities the field marshal utterly lacked and actively despised. He was appointed chief of the Imperial General Staff, the highest professional position in the British Army, and later served as the Deputy Supreme Commander of NATO forces in Europe. To the public, this seemed like the natural progression for a victorious hero. In reality, it was the beginning of a long, painful alienation. Montgomery was entirely unsuited for the peacetime bureaucracy of Whitehall, or the delicate alliance building required in Paris and Washington. He treated prime ministers, cabinet secretaries, and foreign diplomats exactly as he had treated his junior officers, with blunt, uncompromising demands and a chilling lack of patience for opposing viewpoints. He operated under the assumption that having won the war, his judgment was permanently infallible. He clashed bitterly with American generals, most notably his former superior, Dwight D. Eisenhower. During the war, Eisenhower had possessed the diplomatic genius to manage Montgomery's massive ego and abrasive personality, acting as the indispensable shock absorber for the Allied command. But in peacetime, Montgomery's refusal to compromise and his constant, public assertions of British military superiority strained these vital relationships to the breaking point. This growing professional isolation was compounded by a disastrous personal decision. In 1958, Montgomery published his memoirs. Military memoirs are typically exercises in polite revisionism, where old commanders gently defend their legacies while maintaining the dignified brotherhood of arms. Montgomery, however, approached his autobiography as a scorched earth military campaign. He used the pages of his book to settle old scores, aggressively tearing down the reputations of his wartime peers. He criticized Eisenhower's strategic decisions in Europe, belittled the contributions of other British commanders, and presented a narrative where every success was due to his own flawless planning, and every failure was the fault of someone else's incompetence. The publication of the memoirs was a commercial triumph, but a personal catastrophe. It shattered whatever remaining goodwill he held among his former colleagues. Eisenhower, deeply hurt by the betrayal from a man he had fiercely defended during the war, severed contact. British peers distanced themselves. Montgomery had effectively burned the bridges to his own past, isolating himself from the only men on earth who truly understood the burdens he had carried. Psychologically, the venom in his memoirs was a manifestation of his deepening inner void. Montgomery was aging, his physical power was waning, and his relevance was slipping away as a new generation of politicians took the reins of the Cold War. Writing the book was a desperate attempt to exert absolute control over his legacy, to freeze himself in time as the infallible Spartan general. Because he lacked the emotional tools to build new, meaningful relationships in the present, he tried to weaponize his past. He could not tolerate the idea that the world might remember him as anything less than perfect, because perfection was the only defense mechanism he had left against his own profound insecurities. Nowhere was this tragic inability to connect more visible than in his relationship with his only child. David Montgomery had grown up largely in the shadow of a global icon. When Betty died, Montgomery did not pull his son closer. He sent him away to boarding school, replicating the emotional distance of his own Victorian childhood. While Montgomery never subjected David to the physical cruelty he had suffered at the hands of his mother, he inflicted a different kind of wound, absolute emotional freezing. Montgomery interacted with his son less like a father and more like a commanding officer reviewing a mildly disappointing subordinate. He dictated the terms of David's education, his career choices, and his social life with rigid, inflexible orders. There was no warmth, no physical affection, and no room for the boy to express his own identity. When David married, the relationship fractured even further. Montgomery, with his deeply ingrained hostility toward women and marriage, viewed his daughter-in-law not as an addition to the family, but as an intruder disrupting his control. The dynamic became so toxic and strained that father and son spent years barely speaking to one another. The man who traveled the world seeking the companionship of other people's children, trying to play the benevolent father figure to Boy Scouts and young Swiss boys, was entirely incapable of showing basic paternal love to his own flesh and blood. He retreated to Islington Mill, a sprawling, picturesque estate he had purchased in Hampshire. But the property did not feel like a home. It functioned more as a private museum, a mausoleum dedicated to the memory of Viscount Montgomery of Alamein. He parked the actual mobile command caravans he had used in the desert and at Normandy on the manicured lawns. The interior walls were lined with oil portraits of himself, captured enemy weapons, and the countless medals and freedoms of cities he had been awarded. He lived alone among these relics, surrounded by a small staff of loyal, former military servants who maintained the rigid schedules of his wartime headquarters. Every evening, the solitary old man would walk through rooms filled with the ghosts of the Second World War. He would eat his plain meals alone, read his Bible, and go to bed precisely at 9:30 p.m. The world outside the gates of Islington Mill was changing with terrifying speed. The stoic, disciplined Britain of the 1940s was giving way to the cultural upheavals of the 1950s and the impending explosion of the 1960s. The younger generation, the very children of the men he had commanded, were beginning to question authority, discard traditional Victorian moralities, and demand a new kind of social freedom. Montgomery watched this societal shift with growing horror. To a man who had survived his own internal demons by adhering to the strictest possible interpretations of discipline, duty, and emotional suppression, the encroaching modern world looked like sheer anarchy. The cultural revolution of the mid-20th century was not just a political disagreement for the field marshal. It was a direct threat to the psychological fortress he had spent a lifetime building. If the strict moral codes that had forced him to bury his true identity were suddenly dismantled by a new generation, it would mean his lifetime of agonizing self-denial had been for nothing. This terrifying realization set the stage for the final, most revealing battle of his entire life, a battle not fought with tanks in the desert, but with words in the chambers of the House of Lords.